live at Science 5, and this is the beginning of the second part of the 8th sequence. Notice how there's an order, but that the order is part of a single pattern. There is a profound quality to the singleness of a pattern. If a pattern is single to the point of a singularity, very unusual properties occur. In this universe, there are only a couple of examples of singularity. Most examples of singleness, to separate, to make a distinction between singularity and singleness, most examples of things, what makes a thing a thing? The thingness of a thing is that it is single, but its singleness is in terms of a self-identity, which can be stated A equals A. How do you know that A is there? Because this A equals the A that should be there. A equals A is a logical statement, abstract statement of identity. The identity of a thing is its A equals A determinability. That determinability, that this A is A because it equals A, that identity of something is also, in logic, known as a tautology. And a tautology is a circle. A tautology is a circle at its bare minimum. Now you could enlarge it by saying A equals A equals A equals A equals A equals A, and have it like that. A tautology means that you can be confident, you can be certain, you can be exact of what something is, because it is what this is, and this is what this is, and this is what this is, and finally comes back, and it's a closed circle. And a closed circle of that kind of identity, when you pare it down, when you boil it down, is always A equals A. That singleness. But under very special conditions, the tautology collapses. Think of it that A equals A, that the equal sign is like some kind of bar that holds the two A's apart. If the equal sign collapses, the two A's coalesce and they become simply A. This simple A is a singularity. And the best known example of such a singularity is a black hole. And one of the peculiar realities of this universe is that black holes exist. And one of the philosophic astonishments that this is so means that identity is not the bottom line of reality. A is the bottom line, not A equals A. Identity is not the bottom line of reality, but singularity is the bottom line of reality. And so if we are a human being and we want to get to the bottom line, we have to go deeper than our identity. We have to occur as our singularity. And that's what a really superior education will provide. Now, in the past, there have been very rare wisdom traditions and esoteric schools which have done this for a few. But the problem is not to produce more super yogis in the future. The paths that used to be like little deer trails leading to the super yogi are now 20-lane highways. And there are many of them. There are dozens of ways to become a super yogi. Or as Woody Allen says in What's New Pussycat, have you got a minute? The point, though, is to have an education that allows for 100 million people at a time to get to their singularity so that they can deal with issues of reality which are not going to go away and which are radioactive. And that all life is threatened by this. Because untransformed man is now a cancer in the universe. And Mother Nature always has antibodies to take care of viruses. So our species literally is now a destructive force in the natural cycle. And the cure is on its way. So in a very peculiar way, without the millennial apocalyptic dating of year 2000, it is really of interest to note that this particular educational pattern solves the entire spectrum of problems. But it does so at great expense. And the expense is that one has to put a determined effort in long enough for the two pieces of flint to create sparks that will catch fire. And once that flame of your own pilot light is lit, then you're on your own. And you can use this education to develop yourself to whatever extent you need. You can go back to this education. You can take it again yourself. You can do your own version of it, whatever you want to do. Because this education is also a singularity, which is why it's not explainable to someone who doesn't participate in it. And that's not an ideological statement. It's simply a realistic assessment. For someone who doesn't do this, this particular form in its singularity gets misconstrued as a kind of pigeonholed categorization of identities arranged into more or less grids. And this is a problem. So when we come to the 8th section, science of the education, and we come to the middle or the second phase of that 8th section, we're at a strategic place. If we look back to the beginnings, to nature, when we started nature, when we started the course 2 years ago, we started, if you remember, or if you weren't here, perhaps you've reviewed the tape and you can remember, we said that there was not a starting place that was free from skeptical criticism that we could begin with, but there was a dynamic focus that we could just participate with. So rather than starting at some place, we began by participating with a focus that was dynamic and moving. And in order to do that, in order to help us achieve simpatico with that focus, we used a pair of books. We used two books, which on this planet are very good examples of dynamic focuses that need no preconceived place. One of them was the Chinese I Ching, and the other was the Journals of Thoreau. The Journals of Thoreau, being about 20 published volumes, are amorphous in a sense that there's no particular starting point, although you can see where the journal began in the 1830s, but that's a dynamic ongoing beginning. It doesn't just start from there, it just begins to record from that entry point. And they go on for years and years. And as one can see at the very beginning of Thoreau's journals, that he begins as someone who's observing nature, and within a couple of years, he begins to factor in the observer. And by the summer of 1841, Thoreau, who was just about 21 years of age, suddenly flames into universal sagehood. And the journals show that when he's looking and just spontaneously writing in his journal, that his eye sees in a way which the American photographer Edward Weston once wrote in his day books. He said, composition is the strongest way of seeing. That Thoreau begins spontaneously to see with a compositional eye, but that the compositional eye is not in any kind of category, grid, but in a dynamic complementarity, which we now, in retrospect, later on, 150 years later, recognized as a very accurate Taoist vision of the way in which nature works. It has a yin-yang. It has a tao-te. It has a positive minus, dynamical, instantaneous, spontaneous composition, nature. And we said at the time that one of the earmarks, one of the tastes of wisdom, one of the intuitive tastes of wisdom is the ability to make a spontaneous language which is creative of wholes, wholenesses. Have to watch out for puns today. We're talking about black holes. And the I Ching is famous for being a dynamic, ongoing, that it isn't categorical, that you can arrange the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching in some kind of circular motion. But that is not its full capacity, and that's simply an arrangement. It's not the ultimate form of the I Ching. So we began with the I Ching and with Thoreau. But the point we're making is that we're at the second phase of science, which is the 8th phase, and we're trying to get a parallel. We're trying to get a correspondence. So what we would like to know is we're at the beginning of the second phase of the 8th part of the course. What was the second phase of the first part of the course? And we used books all the way through, pairs of books, just for this purpose of giving us indexing markers. It was an interesting process which allowed us, we used the metaphor of legs to walk on. We were able to walk through 2 years of a very mystical pattern, almost impossible to do without some sort of path. And the pairs of books were a path for us. And the best path manifests just one step as you make it. So that if you stop at any moment, there's no more path. It's only by continuing to go that the path continues. That the path manifests step by step. And this is known philosophically in the West, in this country, as pragmatism. And there's a whole logic about this developed by John Dewey. He called it, his book in 1949, which he wrote when he was 90 years old, he called it Logic, a Theory of Inquiry. That the only true rational way to inquire is to be going step by step in complete freedom so that you don't predispose what you're going to find or which way you're going to go. And you say, well, that seems rather chaotic. And we know now that even if that is chaotic, it shows a universal pattern. What is the pattern? The pattern of the infinity sign, the butterfly double attractor. It always appears even in chaos. So that one has no worries whatsoever. To quote Paul Hogan, no worries, mate. No worries at all. Because it doesn't matter, even if you're moving chaotically, the universal pattern will occur. And if you know how to use that, if you know how to consciously recognize, if you know how to recognize by using that conscious pattern, even in a universe of complete ambiguity, you will find your way. That's called freedom. That's called spiritual freedom. It's not like Time Bandits where God has some kind of chart with all the little time holes that you can steal that chart and go off and have adventures and get rich. It's a wonderful metaphor, not the case. And the fortress of ultimate darkness is not some fortress, but is a very curious singularity known as a black hole, which we'll get to. But notice how we're returning again and again, that the excursions are completely free, but we always are able to cycle back, and that the locus of the focuses, the locus of the continual successive focuses form a line, and that this line is called a trajectory, and that this trajectory can even be curved. And such a curved trajectory in modern physics is called a world line. And once one is able to see the geometry of world lines, the whole structure of reality becomes available for our introspection. Because the recognition of it is translatable in a language, a universal language. And true, that language, that higher mathematics, is very difficult to master. But one can, with this education, learn how to comprehend and use it, even though you may not have taken high level of mathematics. Because the education functions whether you have or not. Because conscious differentiation, while it works very well with the language of modern mathematics, higher mathematics, that's only the language expressive function of it. And believe me, there are very intelligent deaf mutes who cannot speak the language, but nevertheless they function very well. And so you may not have the language expressivity, but you will be able to function as if you were masterful at highest levels of modern mathematics, because your differential consciousness will be there. And you can, if you wish, inform yourself. Okay, we're coming back again to the focus. What is this reoccurring focus? It's that the second phase of each season of our education form a world line, a trajectory which has something in common. The second phase of nature begins with the pair of texts, The Particle Connection and the book Galaxies, Timothy Ferris's great huge book, picture book on galaxies, published by the Sierra Club. Why would the Sierra Club publish a book on galaxies? Because the largest scale of preservation of wilderness to allow for our humanity to be free is on scale of galaxies. And that John Muir is not just some kind of ecological simpleton saying, well, we've got to save the redwoods, we've got to save Yosemite, that it's not on that simple level. Muir is genuine, high-quality mystic. And we said at the time, and we'll say it again in a couple of months when we start Nature again. When you read Muir's Yosemite, you come to a point where he has climbed down Half Dome. And it got late in the afternoon. The sun was going down. And he had to turn around and climb back up. And he realized that he had stayed too long, that the light was going, and also that he had physically exhausted himself. His muscles were completely fatigued, and he could not get back up. And that his clinging was beginning to become precarious, and he was going to be a part of Yosemite Valley, some 3,000 feet below. And Muir, the not-so-simpleton, the great mystic, writes that he suddenly realized that he was a goner, but that he was going to be able to die in his beloved mountains. And so he relaxed, and he became at one with the rock of Half Dome. And he said, without even thinking of it, he just walked back up to the top. He crawled and walked back up in one motion. He became a singularity for a brief, non-instant, non-time, because that's the mystic way. Because our spirits are also singularity. Like black hole, they're very rare, but they're quite real. The integrity of our spirit is singularity, is beneath and more fundamental than the identity, and that the identity is always a mask. It is never our face. As Wallace Stevens in one of his poems writes, the good man has no face. I use the example in the apocryphal Acts of John, where St. John is invited into one of the homes of one of the early Christian community in Ephesus, and he goes in to wash up in the bedroom, the back room, and he sees this icon on the wall, this portrait, and he calls in the man and he says, we do not have graven images in our relationality to God. And the man, according to the Acts of John, said, but Master, it is a portrait of you. And St. John, at age 90, had not thought of himself as having a face for so many decades that it was not recognizable. And he looked into the wash basin and saw his reflection in the water basin and smiled and said, so it seems, but that is not what I look like. I do not look like anything. And had the portrait removed. And at that time we quoted the 13th Ode of Solomon, which is mystical celebration that when you wipe the cosmetics off your face and address a mirror by seeing into the eyes of Jesus, that there's no reflection in the eyes of Jesus when he looks at you. And that's how you know who you are. You are not the identity of any mask whatsoever, but you are clear, pure openness. And when you're seen for real, that's how you are seen. That's why it's called the invisible world, because it has no visibility, because it is more bottom line than tautologies. Now this is religious talk, the way we used to talk a long time ago. That kind of religious talk has long since become ideological. There's no way to use it without carting in all kinds of ideological snags that do more to imprison than to free. So no one's going to talk that way anymore, except as a science. But the way to talk now is like an education that comes back again and again to focuses that don't just repeat, that don't just make a succession, but that have a free form periodicity that describe a world line, that when one learns to follow those world lines, the geometry of the real discloses itself to you. What world line are we following now to see the geometry of the real? We're trying to see that here's an educational pattern that's a singularity, that it has 8 phases, and that if we look to these 8 seasonal phases, to the second phase of structure, each one has 3 phases, that there are 3 pairs of texts, followed by a single text as an interval at the end. 4 weeks for each pair of texts, making 12 weeks total, and then a 13th week as a kind of a punctuation, an interval. We're trying to see what's the second pair of books in the first phase as compared to now the 8th. And the first pair of books in nature was the particle connection and galaxies, the very large and the very small. The second pair of books in science now will be Kip Thorne's book on black holes and time warps, and paired with it will be this book called The Conscious Universe by Minos Kafatos. Okay, we'll come to The Conscious Universe and Black Holes and Time Warps as a pair of books in just a moment, but let's take a look back along and trace the trajectory all the way through the course. The course is said to be a singularity, that it not only holds together in terms of identity, A equals A, but holds together when you collapse identity and allow it simply to be A. What was the second phase, the second pair of books in ritual, for instance? The second pair was the Satipatthana Sutra, the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha, and the Bacchae by Euripides, the last great Greek tragedy. What was the second phase in myth? What was the pair of books? Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the Tolkien translation. What was the pair of books in the second phase of symbols? It was Suzanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key and William Blake's illustrations to the Book of Job. And one can go on in this way, and you can trace for yourself the world line of the second phase of all of the 8 seasons, so that one could take a pair of books from nature, from all of the 8, that would give you 16 as a total. You could take those 16 volumes and you could arrange them in a series of 8 pairs. And this would be an indexing matrix which you could then make a very powerful series of ideas, of conceptions, of analytical foundations, and you could look at the entire course from that perspective and learn a great deal. You could then take nature and symbol, that pair of pairs of texts, and make a square out of them. That would be the Book of Job Illustrations by Blake, Philosophy in a New Key by Suzanne Langer, and then the Galaxies by Timothy Ferris, and the Particle Connection by Christine Sutton and a few other authors. You could take the Particle Connection. You could take the Blake Illustrations to the Book of Job, Philosophy in a New Key by Suzanne Langer, and Galaxies, and make a square out of that. And you could pair that square with the pair of books from the second phase of science and the second phase of vision, which is the first part of the second year. And in vision, what was the pair that we used? In the second phase, we used the Art of Memory, Francis Yates' great Hermetic Renaissance study, and the Illuminations of Hildegard of Bingen. So that one could make two squares, pair of pairs here, as a complement, which would be a truncated version of this trajectory, of this world line, of the pairs of books used in the second phase. Now, what I'm showing you is that there is an enormous capacity, an unlimited capacity for analytical development of this education. It can go a long ways. It can get into high mathematics very easily and go as long and as far as you want to go. All I'm doing is showing you what is possible. Has anyone done this so far? I'm the only one. But it's there. It's available. It's an undiscovered country. It probably has Klingons in it, too. There's room for everything. Let's come back now. Let's come back to the pair of texts that we're using in the second phase of science. And we've got all of this context now so that what you're going to hear about these two books, this pair of texts, has all kinds of reverberations, not just metaphorical reverberations, but also analytical capacity for correspondences and many other possibilities. Let's come to this pair. Kephados is very famous. He's famous in the astrophysics community. His really tremendous book, which he edited, published by Cambridge, was called Supermassive Black Holes. Supermassive black holes. And this was a workshop, which was the George Mason Astrophysics Workshop, held at George Mason University in Virginia, 1986. And Kephados was there at that time. And this volume on supermassive black holes is a very, very famous work. Black holes are the last phase of a development of a life cycle of a thing which we know a little about, all of us do, stars. Black holes are a part of a life cycle of a certain kind of a star. What kind of a star? A very massive star. When it gets old, it goes through the process of integration, meaning condensation of its material, and its identity as a star collapses because the equal signs that have been holding the structure together collapse. And the identity of this object as a star collapses with it. The mask, the star, is actually a sun, the smiling or frowning face of a sun. And that whole face withers and collapses. And as that star collapses, it enters into a different phase. Now, if the star is like our sun, it's not massive enough to become a black hole. So it becomes a smaller star, becomes what is known in astronomy as a white dwarf. And a white dwarf is one of the smallest stars available. The only stars smaller than a white dwarf are stars that are too small to begin ignition and become stars in the first place. And those are known as brown dwarfs. If Jupiter were about 10 times the size that it were, with all due respect to Arthur C. Clarke, Jupiter would become a star. If it were only 9 times the size of Jupiter, it would be a brown dwarf. It would be hot enough to almost be a star, but not hot enough, not powerful enough to burst into becoming a star. So that brown dwarfs are the one end of the parentheses of the possibility of a star, and black holes are the other. So that Kafatos wrote and edited a book on supermassive black holes, and then he did the astrophysics of brown dwarfs. So that he took in parentheses all the possibilities, both ends of the life cycle possibilities of stars. Brown dwarfs where they don't quite become stars, and then black holes, which are the final phase of the largest stars. So Kafatos is an extremely interesting person, and out of this comes a very interesting book called The Conscious Universe. And he says in the beginning, this discussion resulted from a dialogue which began some 7 years ago between a physicist himself, who specializes in astrophysics, general relativity, the foundations of quantum theory, and a student of cultural history, Robert Nadeau, a student of cultural history who had done postdoctoral work in the history and philosophy of science. So that a cultural historian of philosophy got together with an astrophysicist, and they were talking, and as they were talking, out comes this book, The Conscious Universe, subentitled Part and Whole in Modern Physical Theory. It's a very interesting volume, published in Berlin, in English, about 200 pages. Now in here, in the beginning, he talks about how the two of them were waiting for the results of the same experiment, but from different angles. He, as an astrophysicist, is waiting in Paris for the results of these experiments, and the cultural historian for his own purposes, waiting for the same results. And it was interesting to them that here, for totally different reasons, they're waiting for the results. The physicist Alain Aspect at the University of Paris South. The experiments were the last in a series designed to test some predictions based on a mathematical theorem published in 1964 by John Bell. Bell is very, very famous in the world of mathematics and physics. In fact, one of his sweet little books is entitled Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics. There are some things you can say, and there are things that you cannot say. But there's a difference, there's a distinction between not being able to say and knowing that you cannot say, and not knowing. Because if you just simply don't know, I mean, you also don't know that you cannot say it. There's something, but you cannot say it. And so speakable and unspeakable are yin-yang of a consciousness which is very penetrating and very real. Goes below the identity, because very often language in its natural function must move on identities. A natural language always moves on identities, and the short form of those identities are images. And the condensed short form images are ideas, so that natural languages roll along on the casters of ideas and images, and they all work because it has a road called identity upon which those little rollers, those little wheels can go. Because without the road of identity, ideas and images do not roll and the language doesn't function. So all natural languages share this particular road of identity, and the geography on which that road of identity of a natural language rolls is called the mythic horizon. Now I know it's starting to get highfalutin, but you have to. We're at the end of our education. The mythic horizon is available to be traveled by someone who can roll their language along on images and ideas. But it takes an assumption, a substrate of a confidence that identity holds. And indeed, in nature, identity does hold. But when one gets really clear-eyed, one realizes that this identity is a consensus agreement and is only provisional and must be given the name apparent. And that this apparency is a very powerful insight. And that only 25 years ago was the first time that a human being on this planet was able to see that the apparent idea of black holes was completely flawed. And that man was Stephen Hawking, the physicist suffering from the sclerosis that atrophies the muscles, and now he's in a wheelchair. And at that time, 25 years ago, related by Kip Thorne in the other book that we're using, along with Kafatos, The Conscious Universe. The book by Kip Thorne is Black Holes and Time Warps. And Kip Thorne relates how Hawking was preparing for bed, and suddenly an idea shattered his whole attentiveness. And he couldn't sleep that night because he realized that the mathematical idea that talked about the shape of a black hole was flawed. And it was very scary because the mathematician who had put that forth was Roger Penrose, a tremendous mathematician, and by 1970 already one of the greatest brains in the world. But Hawking, also very, very deep thinker, as Thorne points out, realized that the shape of the black hole, as posited by Roger Penrose, was only an apparency, and that there was a deeper reality underneath it. And Hawking was able to speak the language of mathematics enough to show that there is an absolute point which occurs at the center of a collapsing star before it reaches the outer edges of the star and swallows it, and the black hole exceeds the star, that in the collapse of the star, the absolute singularity begins at the center of the star, and not just magically that the star is displaced by the black hole. And that because this is true, that black holes have properties. They spin sometimes, and they spin the other way sometimes, and they send quivers of gravitational radiation out. And when two black holes collide, they make an impossibility real. Their combined areas make a horizon which is illogically different from what one would expect. And this is true because they're not singular, but because they're singularities. And when two singularities come together, they have no arms out that are equal signs that forbid a level deeper than identity. And so instead of two, because you have just A and A, they don't come together as A equals A and an A equals A and collide like that, but they simply are A. And that one of the deepest insights to the truth of this occurred in 1932. When a physicist, mathematician was thinking about electrons and realized there was such a thing as a positron. That a positive electron meeting an electron which is negative would vanish each other. And that this antimatter particle, the positron, was real. And that the collision of a positron and an electron and a vanishing of both in a singularity of energy was real. And it took a long time to work out the concept of the positron. And because it is so rare, the book, The Concept of the Positron, published in 1963 by Cambridge University Press by Nansen, is one of the really interesting books of the 20th century. And chapter 9 is one we'll have to come back to after the break. If we were to take this kind of a bracket focus of a pair and try to use this as an initial method, we could index, for instance, all the elements, all the stuff that goes into building the physical universe, the elements, can be arranged, can be indexed by a pair of elements, the initial two elements, hydrogen and helium, held like this. And in fact, there are several ways that we can do this. If we're arranging the known elements by electron valence shells, the hydrogen and the helium are held separately. And the columns that develop underneath them are the limiting columns. And under hydrogen and helium are bars of series of the developments of heavier and heavier elements by the electron valence shells. The heavier the atomic structure of an element, the more shells are available, the more the ability to ionize becomes available. And so one can categorize and make a table, a periodic chart of the elements in this way. We could begin with hydrogen and helium together as a pair. And you could use this as the initial cue, which then arranges an order and a sequence of all of the elements. And if you use that kind of periodic chart, instead of indexing by valence shells, one indexes by the inert or noble gas punctuation. And one comes up with literally 7 levels. Because there would be, if we knew element 118, there would be 7 inert gases. But element 118 hasn't been discovered yet, so there are only 6 inert gases. The first one is helium, inert in the sense that its structure is fairly stable and complete. And so helium is like the period, the punctuation, the stop for whatever hydrogen began. And so using the noble gases as a way of indexing the materia of the universe, hydrogen begins and helium ends, the very first level. And the next noble gas, the next inert gas, neon, punctuates a line of elements. And this is complemented by a similar line of elements that stop with the period, the punctuation of the noble gas argon. So that you begin with hydrogen and helium as two elements at the beginning, and then below that would be two lines of elements, the top one stopping with neon, the bottom one with argon, and they would be the same length. So that you'd have a double bar of elements. Then there's a jump, and one comes to another double bar of elements, somewhat longer, and punctuated again. This time punctuated by krypton, the Superman element, which is actually an inert gas, and xenon. And then one would come to a third bar of even longer of elements. The top bar would be punctuated by radon, the gas that you test for to make sure it's not in your building. And beneath that is a line of elements that is not yet farther than element 105, but eventually will string itself out to element 118, which will be an inert gas, will be a noble gas. How do we know that? Because this is a universal pattern which holds because the indexing has a reality to it. Is not built on myth. Krypton is not a Superman negating element, but is indeed a noble inert gas, which forms a pair with xenon. Just like argon and neon form a pair. Neon lights works by that neon gas. And all of this is guaranteed because the hydrogen-helium template is true. As long as you're going to have elements, as long as there is a focus in this universe, a focus in reality, where elements are able to maintain an identity, have a mask, that mask will have certain properties and qualities, and it will be limited by that condition, but it will also be guaranteed. So the very thing that makes it only apparent also makes it certain. So we have to get rid of a very suspect preconception that apparency is uncertain. No. The truth of the matter, the deep mystical truth of the matter, is that reality is uncertain, and that's a certainty. But apparency is very certain, and that's a certainty also. So there is a kind of a peculiar, wondering quality to consciousness on the differential level. And that science is not knowable at all, is not even imaginable to someone who remains in the natural cycle alone. And that for someone whose feelings and whose thought remain in an integral mode cycle, they cannot do science. But they also cannot do history, they also cannot do art, and they also don't vision. They do not manifest consciousness. This doesn't mean they're not intelligent. Because integral mode has its intelligence and can be very highly developed. But it has a limit to where it can go, and its limit is determined by conditionality, and that conditionality is not uncertain, but is very certain. And that's why there's a limit that's there, which you can trust that the limit is there. Now, one of the qualities in very high mathematics and very far science in the latter half of the 20th century, one of the really great discoveries made by Johnny van Neumann, a very great mathematician, is that one can be certain that there are no hidden variables that are going to make uncertain the reality of the certainty of unspeakableness. That's kind of sounds like double talk. It's actually not. It's not Wizard of Oz double talk. It's actual. Now, the book where the Van Neumann work is in Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, published here in the Princeton University 1955 Mathematics series. And it's mentioned here in John Bell's Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics, right at the very beginning. Let's just try and follow just for a second how something which seems so profound and yet so adrift can be given a context which firms it up so that consciousness can understand. This is a process, instead of working up towards it from the beginning, one is working back from the occurrence. One is working in a deductive way, but not reductive. One is being a Sherlock Holmes, but one is not being a con man. You want to be sure that you're a Sherlock Holmes and not a con man. And as Herman Melville in his book, The Confidence Man, shows, the worst aspect of being a very good confidence man is that you fool yourself. You con yourself. The biggest danger in being a good con man is that you become so good that you con yourself. And that the best con man in the universe is the devil. And the devil has completely conned himself because he's such a great con man. And in Melville's novel, he is a passenger with a white suit and a white hat and a big cigar on a steamboat. And what he loves is creating consternation and bickering and tension among people, because that energy is food to him. They make a wonderful movie. I suggested it to Al Pacino one time. He ignored it. Regards. We're being Sherlock Holmeses, and we're not reducing things down. So we're working deductively. And what we have here is a very curious, peculiar, not a fact, but an actuality. And that is that appearances are certain, and they are certain because the conditions are universally, truly limited to just that. They must be just that. Whereas reality is completely free, and it can be anything that it wants to be, and that it's therefore always and ultimately uncertain, and that also is a certainty. So that the reply that's given to Moses when he's up on Mount Sinai and he sees the flame in the bush, the burning bush that doesn't burn, and he has this mission, this message to go down and tell those people to quit fooling around. Well, those are very stubborn people. Who shall I say sent me? And the flame says, and it's mistranslated always into an identity, into a tautology. I am that I am. Well, if you went back and you told a bunch of sharp, slovenly Jews that I am sent me, somebody's going to be smart enough to say, you're fooling around with this. This is a perfect identity tautology. Get out of here. Whereas the true translation is, I will be what I will be. The I am becomes dynamic. I will be what I will be does not tautologically remains stable, but instead collapses into an unknown singularity. This is why the first word in Genesis, Bereshith, doesn't mean in the beginning or at the beginning. It just simply means ongoing. It's a gerund form. It's mysterious until one gets the hang of it. And when one gets the hang of it, suddenly the distinction becomes a taste. And the taste becomes a very accurate litmus test about what is real and what is just apparent. What is absolute that you can trust, and what is apparent, but you can also trust that. Science is built upon trusting the apparency of the universe, and mathematics is built upon trusting the unapparentness of the open end of the processes that will be what they will be. It's very important, and let's come here to J.S. Bell's statement on the problem of hidden variables in quantum mechanics. Okay, we're saying that modern science, physics, is the most basic of all the sciences, and physics and astronomy together, astrophysics, the most profound of all the sciences, really hard science, spending billions of dollars on Hubble Space Telescope. I hear showing stars being born in the Eagle Nebula just the last day or so. So astrophysics, very hard science. Why is it hard science? Because one can specify the certain limitedness of apparency to any degree of accuracy. And it is certain because the any degree of accuracy can be trusted and reproved and tested for, and you can build experiments and predict what should be the outcome and see whether that is or not. And in modern science, one has come to trust that this is so, that the certainty is there because the limitations of apparency are accurate. That the limitations are accurate. I'm having to choose my words here because I don't want to get metaphorical in anything here. That the apparency is trustworthy because the limitations are accurate is a characteristic of the physical universe, of the visible universe. Whereas the conscious universe is trustworthy because one cannot specify, but the non-specification of it is not due to the fact that you can't grind really fine. It's also due to the fact that you can grind fine, but the finerness keeps on going. You can get finer and finer until you run out of ability to refine. And that you finally then, because you don't have enough time in the universe to keep getting finer, you use a statistical possibility matrix to characterize the real, rather than a delimited certainty exactness. So that the absolute truth is characterized by possibility statistical matrices rather than by the specifications of limitation. The apparent universe is real because it's limited, and the limitedness can be known accurately, but the real absolute universe is also knowable but not determinable with any exactness, with only statistical probability exactness. How was this found out? This was found out over the last 60 years of developments in the world of visionary science and mathematically proved by von Neumann in the early 50s. Here's what Bell writes. Introduction. On the problem of hidden variables, how do we know that there isn't something that we don't know that's going to come in, some hidden variable that we're unknowing about that's going to deceive us? It's a famous modern scientific statement of an old medieval problem. The old medieval formulation was, if God were an evil genius, able to deceive us ultimately, there's no way that we would know that because we would be deceived ultimately. How do we know? It's a very Gnostic thing, right? I mean, it's the Cathari breakfast menu. If God, all-powerful and omnipotent, was an evil genius deceiving us, we would never know that we were deceived. But the fact is, in differential consciousness, one can come up with very accurate proofs as to why this is not so and never has been so and never will be so. Here's what Bell writes. To know the quantum mechanical state of a system implies, in general, only statistical restrictions on the results of measurements. Not exact measurements, but close enough so that the statistical possibility is trustworthy enough for all practical purposes. It seems interesting, writes Bell, to ask if the statistical element be thought of as arising, as in classical statistical mechanics. Does this thought occur? Does it arise? Because the states in question are averages, and one could find individual examples which would be very much better and more accurate. Why trust just a statistical average when you could have a really good individual measurement? Why not just do an individual measurement? Why fall back on statistical probability averages at all? And he's writing, he's saying, isn't this an interesting thought? And then he says, if you don't find this interesting, don't follow this thought at all, because you're not getting it. He says, whether this question is interesting indeed has been the subject of a lot of debate, because there are many physicists, there are many other people thinking about this who don't get it, who dismiss this. But the fact is this is like a razor's edge. And only those who have been cut by it are capable of being blood brothers in a very mysterious ritual. A mysterious ritual which transcends the whole natural cycle. And so instead of being a ritual, it becomes an art. And this art of brotherhood on a transcendent level, of being cut by the razor's edge of this issue, of this question, is like a questing, hunting tribe who are after the biggest game of all, and that is to be able to live a life of reality in complete freedom in a cosmos without end. He writes, this present paper, included in this book, does not contribute to this debate. It is addressed to those who do find the question interesting, and more particularly to those among them who believe that the question concerning the existence of such hidden variables received an early and rather decisive answer in the form of von Neumann's proof on the mathematical impossibility of such variables in quantum theory. And one of the real intellectual triumphs of modern mathematics is here in von Neumann's Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. It's like a test kit, an idea which is a test kit to check whether there is any malfunction possible in the way in which this function is going on. And the readout is all of this mysteriousness is very accurate and very trustworthy. That the uncertainty is not an uncertainty of not knowing, but it's an uncertainty of knowing superconsciously to a point of exactness that vanishes into further accuracy. That the accuracy possible is infinite. One can be infinitely more and more accurate. And therefore one can trust much more than the solidity of things. One can trust the freedom of the mystery of the universe. More than tell the time of day by it, you can stake your life on it. You could stake your eternal spirit on it. Now, this particular quality comes out especially with the issue of black holes. Not only with black holes, but as we said in the pre-break section, it focused itself in the 1930s in the issue about elements and constituents of elements, what makes elements real. Elements are real because they have an identity. Iron is iron. This atom of iron equals this atom of iron. There's no way that you will ever have in any universe that has iron an atom of iron that is not equal exactly to this atom of iron. Unless you ionize this atom of iron, but you can then ionize this atom of iron the same way. So they're equal, they're identical, and the stuff of elements is real because of this tautological identity, and you can trust that. What does the teacher in Conan the Barbarian say to the young Conan? He says, you cannot trust men or women. You cannot trust in most of the ideas and plans of men. But in this, and he holds up an iron sword, he says, in this you can trust. Yeah. And that's true. You can trust the iron that makes the sword. It's going to remain iron. It's going to remain steel. With a few carbon modifications, iron becomes steel. But deeper than that, you can trust the infinite freedom of the spirit. And one can plug in the test kit of differential conscious analysis and find out why to any degree of specificity that you want. And the trustworthiness reads out from the test kit because it never reaches a conclusion, but always comes up with an ever-refined accuracy that continues without end. Because if the accuracy ever had some kind of periodicity that ends it, then you couldn't trust it. Then you could say that the world is flat because there's an edge and you're going to fall off. And if you sail out far enough, you're going to fall off. But the fact is that time itself is without end except in its formed quality. Space itself is without end except in its formed quality. And how do we know this? Because space-time as a fabric, when extended far enough out, curves. And it doesn't curve because the line is curved. The world lines are always straight. It's a mystery. It's not only a mystery in Einstein's theory of special relativity, but in the great American poet Wallace Stevens' theory of poetry, which is on a Kaidman recording, and you can hear it if you can't read it in his book called The Necessary Angel. He talks about Someone like Paul Klee, who lived in a universe vast enough that straight lines were seen to fall. Because the modern artist, along with the modern physicist, already saw this. In fact, the artist saw it visionarily before the physicist. Long before there was quantum mechanics, there was a Cézanne. And if one is differentially conscious and mature, one looks at Cézanne's painting of Mont Saint-Victor and absolutely is stunned, speechless. What can you say? He saw the jeweled facet of a universe which was infinitely free and no longer reducible to the certainty of a limitation. Because Mont Saint-Victor surely is only Mont Saint-Victor, but Cézanne's painting of Mont Saint-Victor is differentially free in the spirit forever. It has all of the infinite facets of a conscious spiritual jewel. Long after Mont Saint-Victor has geologically crumbled, God will have Cézanne's painting hung in the living room. That's Hollywood talk. Trying to say something very profound and mysterious so that it can lodge as a question, as an intuition, if not a recognition or a realization for you. The artist's vision preceded the physicist's vision. Why? Because art occurs before science does in the world line trajectory of the focuses in their sequences. But before the artists saw it, there were visionaries who saw it, because the visionaries are the first. Because consciousness begins with vision. Remember the little parable about St. John? The two most quoted parts of St. John are without vision, the people perish, and when ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Truth makes us free. Truth is not knowing the identity of something. Truth is the freedom for I will be what I will be. It's unlimited. It's accurate and trustworthy because it's unlimited. The Pythagoreans called it apeiron, unlimited. The Tao is Tao because it's not limited. Te is Te because it is limited. If Te were not limited, it wouldn't have any oomph, wouldn't be able to do anything. The hand is a Te. This hand can only perform because it's a hand. But if the space had the qualities of the hand and was limited, I wouldn't be able to do anything, wouldn't be able to move. But the space is unlimited and the hand is limited, and so the hand can move in space. Form can move in background. And that's how reality underwrites the accuracy of the apparent. And so you can trust both reality and the apparent. But the apparent has to be checked to the point of exactness, and reality has to be checked to the point of mysterious continuance of its exactness. That's called conscious maturity. And an education must deliver a population able to do this on level of hundreds of millions of people before more than one more generation happens. Otherwise, it's like Bertrand Russell said, man has never made a weapon he hasn't used. It's a simple sociological fact. And if you use hydrogen weapons, life will cease on this particular planet. Because there will be no end to that. The horror and viciousness is much worse than any nuclear winter. rage, vengeance, and anger when let loose, as Aeschylus says in his great tragedy Agamemnon. When fear and panic are on the streets, no one can survive. Black holes are not a hell. Black holes are not some repository of fear and panic. Black holes are real, and because they are real, they have an absolute singularity. But because black holes are black holes, there's also an apparentness to black holes which can be measured. So the phenomena of a black hole can be measured with exactness and certainty, although it's very difficult to think about it and to find some indexing scale to do so. But the numinous actuality of black hole cannot be measured, and that's a degree of confidence that they're real under the apparency. In Kip Thorne's book, let's come to Kip Thorne for a moment, he has a chapter on black holes evaporating, that over unimaginable time sequences, black holes evaporate and become smaller. But that they do not become smaller in quantum jumps, but their evaporation happens as a smooth, continuous movement that has no parts. The same thing when matter falls into a black hole. When a black hole eats some kind of star field and those stars fall into a black hole, its mass grows. But its mass doesn't grow in increments that can be measured at all, but the singularity has a continuity, and the mathematics shows that there are no steps or stages of growth, but that it is a continuity. So that the shrinking and the growth of black holes is a continuity consistent with singularity, and not at all ratcheted, which would be consistent with apparency. And the first person to be able to think accurately in these terms is the world-famous crippled physicist Stephen Hawking, who realized that the tautology of identity was not refined enough to be able to carry the deep penetrating actuality of what black hole in its occurrence presents to us as chosen language. I have to make an asterisk here. Apparencies represent to us. An identity is always a representation, whereas reality presents to us and is deeper than identity. When you say A equals A, it means that any A represents the A that it is. But when you want to say A, it's just a presentation. It doesn't represent anything. It presents itself. This transition, which is actually a transformation of form. The form of identity transforms. The A equals A as a form transforms by collapse of the final barrier, the equal sign. When identity collapses, then presentation is the only mode that works. Representation no longer works. It's very profound. That's why quantum mechanics cannot be imagined. You cannot make images. Stephen Hawking could not make images, though he tried. And he provisionally worked with images. He thought of two surfaces, two areas that were black holes colliding. And he tried to have an image. Well, what would happen? And he couldn't sleep that night when the idea came to him, because the idea was a transcendent idea. It transformed what he was trying to think about. It went deeper than the level of identity, deeper than the level where images or ideas work. And on that profound level, at that substrate, it's called a substrate because it's deeper than the foundation. Identity is like the foundation of a house, whereas presentational reality is the bedrock below the foundation. The bedrock doesn't represent any part of the house, but presents the house in its wholeness. So that reality always presents, and what does it present? It presents itself. And it is that is real. Differential consciousness is the field of the real. And it is whole, and it actually constitutes a singularity. Thus, the conscious universe means that not only are black holes singularities, but the cosmos as a whole also is a singularity, and functions in a presentational reality which is a substrate to any kind of identity apparency. And the fact that you cannot measure the cosmos is proof positive of its reality on level of singularity. And motion, the wave motion, the radiation of singularity is gravity. What? What? The wave motion, when singularity quivers, the ripples it sends out are gravity. So there is such a thing as gravity radiation from black holes. And isn't it amazing that Kip Thorne is co-author with his mentor and teacher, John Archibald Wheeler, and a man named Meisner. Meisner at University of Maryland, Kip Thorne at Caltech, and Wheeler at Princeton. Wheeler is a great mathematician, physicist, was the teacher of Kip Thorne. This is a standard book on gravitation. It's been the standard book for a whole generation. It was done in 1975 and is still used in 1995 because no one's gone beyond it. They've tried like hell to go beyond it. They have not gone beyond it. If you go over to Caltech and you go to one of the really quiet back loading dock areas and search around like Sherlock Holmes, you will find a little white Quonset hut type building, has a little tiny sign on it, says gravitation research. In all the world, this is the place where gravitation is being researched, right there in this innocuous loading zone. Amazing, isn't it? And after he co-wrote Gravitation, the textbook on gravitation, Kip Thorne wrote Black Holes, the Membrane Paradigm, edited along with a couple of other characters, Price and McDonald. The membrane paradigm. Why? Because we talked about membranes. Do you remember in ritual? Or perhaps you weren't here, or perhaps you don't recognize that this education is really a singularity, really knit together. More than knit together, it is a presentational wholeness. That someone who really masters this gets instantaneous use of all of it together at any one moment. You can bring to bear all of it. It takes a little more than 2 years, but nevertheless, 2 years sets you up, gives you clean bill of health. All you have to do then is just practice, and you can run the 4-minute mile. What about membranes? we learned in ritual that membranes are not walls. That a membrane permits movement, sometimes osmotic movement between one side and another. Sometimes there are, like in cells. Cells are membranes. In between each cell in the body, each cell is a form because the membrane of the cell holds it there. But the membrane of a cell is not a wall. How does electrical impulses go from one cell to another? They go through little calcium atoms, or sometimes potassium atoms, embedded in the cell membrane, not wall, not the cell wall. No, it's not a cell wall. It's a membrane. Those ion channels, because the calcium or the potassium atom is missing an electron in the farthest out shell, and that's how electricity is able to flow from cell to cell through those ion channels. The world-class textbook's done by a woman, incidentally, named Bertha. The second edition is available at university bookstores. This membrane paradigm holds for black holes also. Why? Because cells are singularities. What? Cells have this quality where their movement is of a wholeness. Now you can specify, you can go microbiologically into the apparency of a cell. And you can get exact measurements. You can find out just what the voltage is of any given cell on its, say, calcium ionic gates at any given moment. And when they get clogged up, the cells don't do well, and you get numbness. And you wonder why? Well, it's a couple of billion calcium ions are not happening the way they should be. There's a condition sometimes called arthritis. It's an electrical fault metabolically. I say, we didn't even get to the dark matter problem. You're going to have to come back next week.